Holy Gospel according to Mark, the first chapter. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord. The place was packed. Every last person in that town had come to the synagogue on that particular day. Even the ones that used to only show up on the high holy days, even they came out that day. Wall-to-wall people in the synagogue. Andrew, Simon, James, John had done a great job of rousing up the folks to say, "Come and hear this new guy." It wasn't only them. His reputation had preceded him. People had begun to speak about the marvelous preaching he had done in the villages all around. He had come down to the lake, he had met their fishermen, and now he had come to their town. A super special guest. They were chosen to hear the new rabbi, to hear what he had to say, to hear how he spoke. Some said his preaching was so amazing that you thought you were hearing the words of God, God's self. Now the Israelites had for a long time looked for someone who was going to bring the word like Moses did. Way back when in the wilderness, before Moses had died, he had promised the Israelites that God would send another prophet, a prophet like himself, a prophet who would declare liberation from bondage, a prophet who would lead them into the glorious new day in which Israel would be a great nation once again. They had lived with that expectation from generation to generation. And every so often they had hoped that this was the one. Prophets had come and proclaimed, and some of them had been pretty significant. And their words were recorded on scrolls and kept in the synagogue and read and studied. Others had sounded okay, but then they'd sort of faded off, and no one really could remember their names. Could this be the one who fulfilled the promises which Moses had made to them? Could this be the one? And so they came, wall to wall, watching, waiting, and listening. And then Jesus stands up in their midst and begins to speak to them in a way that really struck them. They listened quietly, patiently, attentively, hanging on to his every last word, because this was special. If for no other reason than they had been blessed by the new rabbi, the new hot rabbi in the region. But even more, there was something happening in their system that said, listen up, pay attention. They all sat quietly, all of them, except one, Crazy Eddie. Crazy Eddie would always come to synagogue. He hung out on the fringes of the synagogue, and usually he was okay. Sometimes he'd act up a little bit, sometimes he'd start to move around, sometimes he'd cause a bit of a commotion, but everyone was used to him. Everyone knew him in town, they knew his family, knew his history, and they all sort of cared for him. They wanted to make sure that he was taken care of, even if he couldn't handle it himself. They watched, and as everyone's paying attention to Jesus, suddenly, Crazy Eddie goes a little wild. And he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are." And the people around him just trying to, Eddie, sit down, no, and he wouldn't stop. He kept yelling and yelling and yelling. He just got louder and louder and louder and louder, until finally Jesus had enough. And he turns and he silences him by casting out that which kept Eddie from being all that Eddie could be. And the unclean spirit left, and Eddie silenced down. The thing that nobody quite got is that Eddie really got it. That he might be a little off, but that those who had the most to fear from Jesus, the most to fear from Jesus' power and authority, were the ones who were going to claim him and name him most clearly. Where everyone else wanted to be polite, the powers of evil, the unclean spirits of the world, had no interest in doing so. They wanted to make it quite clear who Jesus was. And so Eddie spoke the truth. Jesus was the Holy One of Israel. He was the chosen one of God. And he had in fact come to destroy us. Not in the way that we usually think of destruction, namely to be wiped out and to be just completely eradicated. Not that kind of destruction. Not the destruction you see from tornadoes that come through, but the kind of destruction that works on that which keeps us from being what God intended us to be. The kind of destruction that's required to remove the brokenness of our lives and to allow the space to be opened up for the new way of Christ, the new way of God, to become our way. Only when we destroy that which prevents us from living the full life of God can we experience the fullness that Jesus has to offer us. The crowds were just blown away, absolutely stunned, not only by his words, but by the power he had. His fame spread, but many really didn't get the new thing that Jesus was doing, the new thing that God has in store for us all.